Really what changed for me was understanding that I had to surrender everything that I was doing and say, God, what do you actually want to do with all this stuff?
Humans are story-driven people. We are looking to be a part of some story.
The idea of being a storyteller was actually more, Eric, you tell too many stories, your head's in the clouds, you talk too much. And so I associated storyteller with negative. Business as ministry, and what I realized was I saw the opportunity everywhere except my workplace.
10 o'clock at night, can't go to sleep. What are you thinking about?
I think the thing that I'm thinking about the most is, I think many of us believe that God is not active in his creation.
Eric, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've talked once before. I'm excited to meet in person. So tell me, I guess, to start, just a little bit of your background, who you are, what you're doing.
Absolutely. So Bethel grad, came out of college, jumped right into the workforce, American Express Financial Advisors, doing the finance thing and all that, and just felt this stirring to go do my own thing.
Yeah.
So long story short, fast forward, I run a software company called Carousel Signage now. What we do is we communicate with employees and students on digital displays or on tablets or mobile devices. So run a software company. That's my main day gig.
Do the digital displays include the ones that are at urinals?
No, that was not a target
Okay.
market for us. I wanted it to be, but yeah,
I was going to say those ones always catch my attention.
Those were
They
amazing.
get a captive audience.
Yeah, those were definitely amazing.
So you skipped over a good chunk from what I saw on LinkedIn. It looked like you had a lot of things that you've done with a kind of entrepreneurial background.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about that and whatnot too before we...
Yeah, so to fill in the blanks a little bit more, I stepped out of my nice paying job at American Express when my kid was 3 months old, because that's what you do when you have
Natural
a kid.
timing.
You step aside from your good paying job and you try to build a business from scratch. And so that's where you see some of that formation for me was really this stepping into an entrepreneurial thing. I was pretty convinced that I was just going to instantaneously be successful. I would just figure it out and it would all be great.
And how long was that instantaneous?
It was about 2.5 years.
2.5 years?
Yeah.
That's not bad.
Yeah. And then it was interesting. So really what happened there is I got to a point where it was pretty clear that by my own ingenuity and work effort and all those types of things, it didn't matter how good at things I was, business wasn't going to be successful or my career wasn't going to be successful if God didn't pour into it.
Yeah.
And so I would say that really what changed for me was, and I think we'll probably dive into this a little bit more, was understanding that I had to surrender everything that I was doing and say, God, what do you actually want to do with all this stuff? Yeah. And that's when things started changing. So when you look at that timeline on my LinkedIn profile and things, it was, as soon as I did that act of surrendering, then things started changing and moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Cool.
So, yeah.
Cool. I mean, that kind of is my obligatory, what do you do networking question. So now we've got that out of the way, we'll come back to some of that stuff, obviously. But what else do you just have going on in life right now?
Ooh, yeah, I got a few things going on.
Yeah.
No shortage of those things. I lead worship in the church, so I love that. So that's kind of a part-time role. So lead a company by day, lead worship in the church. I've got 3 kids that I'm actively investing in. So a 21-year-old son. I got a 19-year-old daughter who will be 20. Got a 15-year-old who's a freshman in high school. So those 3 keep me busy. Yeah. And love being part of the church. And I also launched a podcast, kind of like this one last year. I never had plans on launching a podcast. But I felt like God was very clearly telling me to, so I stepped into that last year. So,
and what's the name of that one?
The name of the podcast is The Grand Weaver.
All right.
And basically, the whole podcast is around people who are on the front lines who have a tremendous calling and sense of purpose, who lack resources, connecting them with people who have a lot of resources and are looking for a little bit of purpose for those resources. And so that's the Grand Weaver is God who is weaving those stories together. Yeah. So that's kind of the idea. So we just feature different nonprofit ministries around the world and tell their stories. Yeah.
Well, so you've got the work at Carousel Digital Signage. You've got the worship side of things that you're doing. You've got the Grand Weaver side of things that you're doing. Yeah. Just in the the little bit of, online stalking that I did, I just had this question that came up as I was looking at everything, is there's, even with some of your previous businesses as well, there seems to be this intersection of community and communication.
Yeah.
On the signage side, marketing side, you've got messages that you're getting down in front of people, worship leading, Grand Weaver helping other people tell their stories.
Yeah.
And let me make sure I got this right. Well, it's easy to get right. Bethel Singers.
Yeah.
When you were at Bethel.
Yeah. It was
So that
part of the Bethel
goes
Singers.
back a while. What?
Yeah.
Am I making something up here when I was looking at that, or is
No,
there
I think
some thread there?
Yeah. So what's interesting about that thread is, and actually this is a learning for me in the last couple of years, when we really step back and we ask ourselves like identity questions, like who are we? One of the things that I realized not until a few years ago, when I was sitting in a business meeting, as a leadership team, we were talking about like different strengths of the leaders on the team, and this lady looked at me that was like a consultant to us, and she said, "Eric, your superpower is storytelling."
Huh.
And that caught me off guard, because my whole life, the idea of being a storyteller was actually more, Eric, you tell too many stories, your head's in the clouds, you talk too much. And so I associated storyteller with negative things. And as I started to understand that God actually wired me as a storyteller, and that comes out in all these different things, and that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
And to embrace that, I think that's really what's opened me up, because I didn't see all those threads for a long time. And then when I started to really embrace, wait, God has given me the ability to tell stories and for his purpose. And so I think that really did inform me, and it took back that identity that the enemy's redefined.
Yeah.
Well, no, that means you got your head in the clouds, you talk too much, you tell too many stories. And it was interesting. I had an opportunity to sit down with Dave St. John at KTIS, and I was just sharing with him a little bit. And he said, "Well, you realize we hire consultants to help us tell stories? Embrace that." And so that really, for me, has been a journey over the last couple of years of trying to understand what does it look like to be a storyteller, and why do these stories matter?
Yeah.
And so for me, at the heart of all these things is, I want people to feel seen and known, and that they matter. And so whether I'm leading worship in the church, inviting people in, or even in the workplace, like every employee knowing that they have a place there, how they fit, that they actually matter as part of the team, regardless of what their job is, I think is a pretty important thread for me. And so I would say not until the last few years have I really started to come into understanding how that actually plays out.
That's interesting. I don't know how I'm going to follow my notes here exactly. But one of the things that I wrote down was, I believe we're called to love and serve others as we journey through this life together. That's right on your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because have you ever gone to any of the both of us being Bethel alums, any of the Bethel stuff that Dan Dye has been to?
I have not, but I know he's hosted some of the events, but I haven't made it to any of them.
One of the things that I found interesting whenever Dan spoke, and he was the CEO at Ardent Mills, so large, Cargill, CHS, I think ConAgra, joint venture. He talks a lot about love. It's not a word you hear a lot in a business setting.
Right. Yeah.
So the first question, which is a yes or no question, which are bad questions for this kind of stuff, but I wanted to ask it anyways, is, do you use the word love at work?
I do.
You do?
I do.
All right. Well, that's the better answer for me then for the follow-up. How does that come across in the workplace? And what kind of it's a unique aspect, and obviously we haven't dove into it deep here yet, but you've mentioned your faith multiple times, so that's obviously a core aspect of what's driving you, which I want to get to. But how's that accepted in the work environment?
Well, I think it depends on who the person is. It certainly is not common, and so some people it might catch a little bit sideways.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you walk in relationship with people enough, it's maybe not as surprising to them to hear it. And so I don't just throw it around willy nilly like, hey, I love you, man. Like that's not really that appropriate. But I think there are clearly times when I feel like, okay, we have a level of trust and relationship where I can say that and people understand the context for that, because I think we have to be a little bit careful because the word love is used in so many different ways in our culture. Sometimes it's actually not that helpful.
Yeah.
And so I think I would say that when I do use it, I'm pretty mindful of the context for particular conversation. I do use it in writing when I talk about really loving my team and what does that mean, and where I have an opportunity to expand on what I mean by that a bit. I think I would tie it back to the number one core value that we have in our company is compassion. And I think you can link compassion and love pretty closely to one another. And so I think it sort of flows out of that context a little more naturally than it might in other other places.
Yeah, no, I just saw that, and that was one that I've thought a lot about when you look at companies, mission, vision, values, all that kind of stuff. And you look at values, I mean, I think almost every company puts integrity at number one, which I always then question, why do you have to put, everyone puts integrity, and why are we doing that? But that's my own personal thing on it. But I've wondered a lot, like, why doesn't love show up more? Because at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we all crave. Is to your point earlier, be known and seen by people. Yeah. And I remember Dan shared a story once of an employee that he was having a conversation with, and he, to your point, he doesn't just say it flippantly, and it doesn't lose the power. And he seemed to be very intentional in his use of it. And the person came to him and was like, no one's told me they love me in 10 years. Yeah. And just the power of that. Yeah, so
it's significant. I mean, if you look at all the employee workplace studies that talk about why people leave jobs and things, it's simple stuff like my boss didn't say hi to me. They didn't remember my name, like all these types of things. Well, what if you take that a step further and you actually do live life with people? I mean, we'll step into how I view ministry, but when we start thinking about how many hours we spend with this group of people compared to how many hours they spend with anybody else, if they're not being seen and told that they matter at work, it's fairly unlikely that they're probably being told that very many other places in their life. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. What is the single most motivating factor in your life? I'm trying to, with another guy who was really talking about it in missional language, trying to ask it in a different way than, what's your why? Yeah. But for me, it's I want to talk about it from like a driving force perspective, because by nature, I'm probably more apathetic and okay with just letting things be. Yeah. And God's obviously brought these driving forces into my life. So what's the single largest thing that's kind of your driving force in what you do and why you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I do really, my single driving force is quite simply pointing people to Jesus. It really is. And I know that's probably that's the Sunday school answer we should give. Like how that happens, I think has changed over time for me in my understanding of what it looks like to point people to Jesus. And it can't be a one size fits all approach. Like you said, even using the word love or those types of things. When I boil it down and I think, okay, how can I most effectively point people to Jesus? If I go down a layer from that, I would say that it is primarily helping people understand how Jesus sees them. Because when you think about most of our struggles are an identity crisis. When we don't understand who we are, our value, our worth from the King of Kings perspective, like we have the world's perspective, we have our coworkers' perspective, we have everybody else's perspective, but oftentimes we don't have the King of Kings perspective on what he says about us. I'm unworthy. Well, you were worthy enough to die for. Like, think about that for a second. Hey, this is what God's word says about you. This past year, for example, Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge came to our church and they sang in the choir. I was invited to give the message. The only thing I did in giving the message was read Psalm 91. Yeah. And when you read Psalm 91, it talks about how we're God's handiwork and how we were knit together in the womb, and how the creator of the universe thought this much about each one of us. And so when I say like point people to Jesus, I mean very specifically helping people understand who they are in Christ.
Yeah.
I know when we look in the mirror, we tell ourselves all the negative things. And so I want to be one of those people that are telling people, but here's actually what God's word says about you. Here's what he says about you directly.
Yeah.
Because I think that opens people up to, maybe I do want to know this King of Kings. Maybe he's not so embarrassed by me. Maybe my shame doesn't have to keep me from a relationship with him. And so I think that's probably at my core what motivates me the most. It does not matter if I'm at work. It does not matter if I'm on a podcast or if I'm leading worship in the church. I want to tell the truth of who Jesus is, the promises that he makes, and what he says about you.
Yeah, that hits home for me because a mentor of mine who I met randomly at a Caribou does
or perhaps not so randomly. But
yeah, perhaps. The guy that I was supposed to meet, I saw get up and leave.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a second. I thought I was supposed to meet with him.
Yeah.
And then this other guy's sitting there who this other gentleman had been talking to. I'm like, where'd Glenn go? He's like, oh, Glenn's got a meeting in St. Paul. And I'm like, oh, I thought I had a meeting with him in Bloomington right now. Like, well, I just had an hour open up. Who are you? Yeah. So yeah, we just sat down, and I mean, that's 10 years now. So yeah, to your point, that's one where it's looking back like, okay, maybe God had a reason for putting this guy in my life, which plays to what you're talking about. His whole thing is helping people figure out what their core purpose is, and it's taking what you're good at and putting it what you care the most about.
Yeah.
And I was struggling to figure out what I cared the most about. And when we boiled it down, it's like at the core, it's identity.
Yeah.
I want, from a personal perspective, I want people to know who they are as children of God. From a business perspective, I want businesses to understand, who they are, how they maximize what they're doing, and go make that impact. Yeah. Same with a community, with anything. How have you brought that aspect directly, but then also maybe shades of it into your work, where that same desire for and I might be just speaking my own truth on you here, and you can tell me, Royce, that's not where I want to go with this, but I've seen that play out uniquely because there's that core desire to talk about somebody's identity and help them see who they are as a child of God.
Yeah.
Do you also have that just identity aspect? I mean, storytelling is interesting to me from the standpoint of stories define who we are as humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking too much.
No.
I put some stuff out there.
Yeah.
I'll let you react to it.
So I think what I maybe want to do is back up a little bit to, I don't want to paint the picture that like I've always been on mission and I've had it figured out, and like for sure not that.
Yeah.
About 9 years ago, I was invited to a luncheon where I was presented with the idea, and I would say before this luncheon, I would have, if you'd asked me that question, like, how do you view ministry? I would say, I'm always looking at how I balance the funding of ministry or doing of ministry.
Yeah.
So am I making enough money at my job to fund ministry things that are happening that somebody else is doing?
Yep.
Or am I doing them? And I always had a balance between those. I'm funding some things, and I think I should be doing those. That was my philosophy at the time.
Yeah.
I went to a luncheon about 9 years ago and presented with this idea that, and I'd never heard the term business as ministry.
Yeah.
It's fairly common now. It's starting to get kind of grooved in and those types of things. But I was like, business as ministry. And what I realized was I saw the opportunity everywhere except my workplace, which is like kind of strange now for me to think about it that way. But I just kind of assumed my work was my work, and that was sort of hands off. I would have not imagined 9 years ago saying the word love at work. I wasn't shy about my faith and those types of, like, I didn't hide from those things, but I never viewed the workplace as a place where I could advance the kingdom or speak into people or disciple or those types of things. I viewed it as the place I made money to pay for those things to other places, or get enough time off to go do it myself.
Yeah.
And so when that switched in my brain, And it took several years to even understand how to live that out. That's really what opened it up for me to understand that, boy, I spend 50 hours a week with these people. And so perhaps we can be in relationship, and I can just look differently at this whole opportunity to speak into them and to be spoken into myself. And so to me, it all comes down to the people that we walk through life in relationship with. How are we walking alongside and showing up for them, loving them, speaking into their life, calling things out in them? So on the identity piece, kind of fast forwarding that part of the question, I can't encourage somebody in their identity or their exploration of that thing if I don't know anything about them.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty hard.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just encouraged me to be much more intentional and be more available. Maybe not quite so agenda driven, like around the numbers, their tasks or those types of things, but giving more space to just be in relationship. And that has paid tremendous dividends in the workplace culture, in personal relationship.
Yeah.
So
no, that makes a lot of sense to me. How have you leveraged now your gift of storytelling as the CEO of Carousel? Because oftentimes I don't know if people necessarily think of their CEO or boss or president as a storyteller.
Yeah.
How have you seen that play out and work for you?
So yeah, and I've learned a lot about this in the last few years. So one of the other things that happened for me to understand kind of my role a bit more was during COVID time, we actually brought in a new VP of sales.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because what he noticed was when a customer would ask a question, and I honestly didn't even realize this. He goes, "Hey, do you realize how you answered that question? You answered that question with a story." And so I remember I was on a call with the University of Minnesota, and they were asking a very technical question about our software. And the University of Minnesota uses our software. And I answered their question by telling a story. I didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
And so what we started doing was and the other thing about me is I'm way better off the cuff than I am, Eric, sit down and write the 5 selling points of your software or the value proposition of this thing or whatever, right? And I'm not very good at that. When I'm off the cuff, completely caught off guard, somehow for whatever reason, I can pull together the most clear answer out of my brain. So that's what we started doing was he would just randomly turn on a Zoom call, record it, ask me a question about a thing I didn't know anything, I didn't know it was coming.
Yeah.
And then he started documenting those things. And so what we've learned over the last few years is my primary role is actually the second core value. So I talked about compassion for us. Our second core value is clarity. And so where that shows up for me as a storyteller is it's one thing to create a strategy for a company, but most people don't really have clarity around the why of the strategy, how we're getting there.
Yeah.
It's not really the strategy itself that's the issue. It's most of us buying into the strategy, understanding how we fit in it. And so
there's gaps.
Yeah.
There's gaps in everyone's mind that they need filled in.
And so for me, it has been develop your storytelling craft in service to clarity. So don't just tell stories for story's sake. Tell stories to elicit an action or a response or to bring about clarity. And so just yesterday, I recorded a video for our whole organization trying to provide some context around a new thing that we're launching. Why are we launching this? What are we hoping it will do? How will it help an organization? How do you present this to customers? How do we not present it to customers? And why do we not do it that way? And so I'm trying to spend way more time like crafting the right messages.
Yeah.
And just using that, because before admittedly in most of my life, I just like to tell stories. I just tell stories for story's sake. Now I think I'm understanding the benefit of,
intentional story.
In the spirit of compassion, and we want to celebrate this as a core value, as a culture thing. I want to tell a story about somebody who showed compassion to a customer or to one another, those types of things. Okay, that's a good use of storytelling. And so I think that's kind of where I'm learning that, on the fly a little bit too. So
do you think, is most of your storytelling right now internal or external focused?
Both, because it depends on, so there was a podcast that got released yesterday around company culture. So there's a lot of storytelling on this podcast I was invited onto. If I'm at a trade show, industry event, I've been invited to Apple Cupertino in front of higher ed leaders, those types of things. There's where I would do external storytelling. hey, here's who we are, here's how we see things, here's the challenges we see you facing, here's how we think we might help, those types of stories.
Yeah.
And then internally, it's much more around clarity of, okay, remember, this is what we said we're about. This is how we go to market together. This is how we support one another. And it's primarily storytelling. I don't do a whole lot of doing at this point in my career. So
storytelling's doing.
Yeah,
it's a very doer thing.
Yeah, it's one of those things though, right? And I talk about with all of our leaders, when they transition from a individual contributor role to a leader role, you don't get as many tasks to check off the list. And it's like my wife will come home from work and, what'd you do all day? Well, I sat around and I thought, and then I told some stories. You did what? You didn't do these 6 concrete things in your day. You felt like you provided value. Nope.
Yeah.
That's a hard transition. It's probably a different podcast episode, but I think that's a pretty hard transition for leaders.
Yeah. Well, I think the storytelling's a very interesting thing to bring into the business world too, just from the standpoint of kind of like I said earlier, humans are story-driven people. We are looking to be a part of some story. Yeah. And if you're doing that both internally, it gives your employees a sense of being a part of something bigger than themselves. Yeah. In a way that I think a lot of employers probably struggle to do. And then likewise with clients, it probably builds more of a actual partnership relationship, because if you get buy-in on that story, you're actually sharing that story together. Yeah. And now it's not just a product or something like that. You're actually walking alongside them in the implementation or whatever. Their success and your success is shared that way.
Yeah, and it's pretty important to have a team, just to be clear. A team, like, you can't just tell stories. You got to have people that are like, hey, here's how the RFP gets filled out and all the details, and here's the code that we wrote and the SOC 2 compliance that we achieved.
The actual doers.
Yeah. So it's a good combination. And back to your point earlier about identity, like, it's important for us to understand how we're wired. Yeah. Because God wired us in a particular way to play a role. You think about the scriptures talking about hand versus feet. We need everybody on the team. And I think that's what's been fun leading this organization in the last few years, is really discovering how God's wired each person for their particular role on the team. And I think this is hard for us, because we always want to play somebody else's role, usually. Yeah. Like, there's just something about us in our humanity that's like, well, that role looks cool. I want to do that one, even though I'm not wired for it at all.
Yeah. It's just that inner nature of always comparing and thinking that the grass is greener and
for sure.
All that. What, switching gears a little bit, what's the number one thing that's on your mind nowadays across the spectrum? When you're just sitting there, 10 o'clock at night, can't go to sleep, what are you thinking about?
I think the thing that I am thinking about the most is, if we're so, I don't know if the right word is convinced. I think many of us believe that God is not active in his creation. And when you look at our culture, when you look at the stories that we hear every single day, most of them, in large part, are negative. They're the bad things. They're the division. They're just the hard things to deal with in life. And you can see the effects on it at every age group across this nation, right? And I would say, I would imagine, in large parts of the world. And for a father of 3 kids, that breaks my heart, because there's young people that have never known any different than the climate that we're in right now. And I firmly believe that God is living and he's active and highly engaged in his creation. Yeah. And so even like, why this podcast? There are people doing amazing work all around the world today. Things we have no idea that are happening, that are transforming and making a difference in people's lives. And so for me, the thing that I stay awake at night about is how do we raise awareness to all the good things, to all the transformation, to all the breakthroughs, to all the healing, all the things that get drowned out by all the negative stuff. And that's hard to do. I was just looking yesterday, there's a Facebook group that has 32,000 Christian podcasters signed up. I'm like, I didn't even know there was 32,000 Christian podcasts, right? Imagine, like,
I didn't know there were 32,000 podcasts.
Yeah, just there's so much, I don't don't want to call it noise.
Yeah.
But even like in everything that we have, there's just so much information, content, all the things that are getting created every day. And by and large, a lot of it's pretty negative, right? And so in my heart, it's like, how do we tell the stories that are the compelling God stories, the stories of hope?
Yeah.
Like if I want to boil it down, I want people to have hope.
Yeah.
Like that's what keeps me awake at night. And I think there's a lot of people that don't have hope, and they don't even know where to look for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, it makes complete sense hearing your story. Kind of like, you know, you're in the digital signage space. Yeah. You are literally putting messages out there that people are seeing. You've got that actual professional background in it. You pair that with your storytelling and your the worship leader side of you, all that. I mean, it's clear that there's a deep desire to communicate truths out there into the world that hit home with people.
Yeah. And it's funny because when you describe all of those things, I never would have sketched that out on a piece of paper when I was back at Bethel College at the time. What's your career plan?
Yep.
Didn't include 9/10 of the things that you just listed out. I never, and that's why I love when God gave me the name, the Grand Weaver, for the podcast. I knew it right away because he weaves all of those things together in ways that we couldn't have scripted.
Yeah.
Right? Why do I believe that God's word is real? Because it's just quirky enough, right?
Yeah.
Because we never would have written the story the way that it was written if you wanted people to buy into it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about my own story. I look back and I'm like, only by the grace of God would he bring all of these things together, and even leading up to us sitting across from each other today. It blows my mind in the most beautiful way. I look back, it's like, God loves me this much to bring me into relationship with all of these people and to allow me to serve in the ways that he's allowed me to.
Yeah.
And, you know, even Bethel as an institution, you know, I didn't grow up in the church, and there was a lot of brokenness in my family, and the Bethel community and family loved my family so well. It was transformational. And if I could share just one story on that. My mom was struggling with alcohol. I was a freshman in college. Judy Mosman was the dean of students at Bethel. And I was walking down the hallway, and she put her arm around me and told me that she was praying for my family. I knew her, but I didn't know that she even knew my name. But she did, and she was praying for my family. I share that story because fast forward 25 years later, I was at her granddaughter's graduation party. My mom was invited to that same graduation party. I look across the room, and you don't get to see this very often, right? But I look across the room, and Judy, who was faithfully praying for my mom, and my mom were standing in the corner reflecting on how good God was and the families that were blessed together. And I knew at that moment that Judy didn't realize that was my mom that she was praying for 25 years earlier.
Yeah.
And you just step back and you see those things, and so that's when I think about it, it's like I want to celebrate those stories. The fact that God was working 25 years ago and blessing things that you might not see for 25 years, 30 years. You might not ever see them in your lifetime. You might get to see the fruit of some of those things a few years from now, but that's really, I was just kind of blown away by God allowing me to see that moment of him saying, I am faithful, right? I am good, even before you knew it. And so that's just kind of what I go back to, I guess.
Well, those stories are all interesting to me from the standpoint of thinking about what we're calling this podcast, which is Beyond Brokerage.
Yeah.
You know, we sit down and we get paid by these generally transactional services.
Yeah.
The way that we always talk about it is they're the outflowing of the things that we're actually trying to do, which is build relationships with businesses and impact people and communities for good. And it just so happens that every now and then a building gets sold and we get paid when that happens. Right. And I'm looking at how you're portraying everything that you care about, and just thinking about it like however the right words would be, but you know, beyond signage.
Yeah.
You know, because even with what you're doing, from what I can tell, day to day and what Carousel's built to do, I mean, you're built to get a message out.
Yeah.
You're built to get some sort of communication out there to people.
Yeah.
And then when you sit down like this, our first time actually sitting across from each other, hearing your story, it's like it seems like you're built to get a message out.
Yeah.
At your core.
Yeah.
You happen to help run a company that does that for pay, I assume.
Yeah.
Assume you're not a nonprofit. We didn't talk about that, but you've.
Well, I mean, if you haven't made any money for a few years, are you a nonprofit?
I don't know.
Just depends on how you define that.
That's a tax question, I guess. But it's just interesting to hear that story and what we're hopefully trying to do here, which is like we're so much more than the work that we do. The work we do is important.
For sure.
But we don't want to be defined by the work, yet listening to your story, it makes complete sense kind of why God has you where he has you. You're not defined by your work. It just so happens that the work that you're doing fits perfectly with how God's defined you.
For sure.
Yeah,
and that's it's funny because I think at times I pause and I go, man, I wish I knew a decade earlier what I eventually knew, right? I mean, and you have that tendency, but at the same time, it's like, well, but God needed to shape and line up all those things, and he had a purpose in all of that. Yeah. One of the lines that, man, it kind of rocked me, that really quick summary I gave you at the beginning of that transition from American Express to all the painful 2.5 years or so until I started getting on the right track. There's this guy, and he's a ministry guy, and we're in a car one time, and he goes, yeah, I was thinking about the 40 years in the wilderness, and he goes, it's like God had to get the Egypt out of the Israelites. And when he said that, I was like, oh, yeah, I think God had to get corporate America wealth generating out of Eric in that 2.5 years. There was a reason why I had to be in the wilderness, because I wouldn't have depended on him. If it would have just been on me, I'd have just kept depending on myself. And so I think sometimes if there's somebody listening to this who's going through a rough patch, a wilderness type season, it might be because God's calling you to trust. So.
All right. Let's just finish up with where do you see things going for you in the next however long time frame? We only got a couple minutes, but what's next for Eric right now?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm asking myself continually this question because I don't know where the business is going. It'll be interesting to see where this podcast is going. All I can do at this point is continually ask God, give me eyes to see and ears to hear what you're doing right now, and what are you preparing me for? And so I think my posture right now is openness, because I literally don't know whether I'm going to continue on. I don't see myself continuing on in the business role for the next decade. I don't see that happening. The podcast is very interesting. See where that goes. But I would say that I literally don't know the answer to that question. All I know is my posture right now is, Lord, what are you stirring? And I will keep open to wherever you're leading, because I think it's going to be quite different than anything I can probably imagine at this particular moment. So that's
an honest answer. And we'll end with that. Thanks for being here, and we'll talk about that next time we get together.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for having
Eric.
me.